In this module, we'll examine ways to make several types of classroom activities meaningful and manageable. Consider these three different learning cycle scenarios. For the exploration phase, students are given 10 seeds with 2 pots or cups with soil. They are then given the procedure to plant 5 seeds in one pot and 5 seeds in another pot or cup. They are then told to water each pot with 5 ml of water. The next procedure is to label one pot with seeds light and place it in the light, and the children are then told to label the other pot dark and place it in the dark. They are told to check their pots with seeds each day and write their observations and measurements in a journal. They are also told to water the pots with 50 milliliters of water every other day. Once data is collected, they write conclusions about the differences in the plants and the factors affecting those differences. Here's another scenario. For the exploration phase, students are asked the following questions. Do seeds need light to sprout? How can we find out? The children have a class discussion where they decide what they would need to answer this question. They decide that each group needs 5 seeds in one pot of soil and 5 seeds in a second pot. This is because just one seed may die, so they need to increase the odds that one will take. They decide on the amount of water to water each pot and how often. The children then decide to place one pot in the dark cabinet and one in the light, and they decide to make observations and make measurements each day. The children write a hypothesis as to whether they think seeds need light to sprout or not. In the concept invention, students will present and discuss their findings. Here's a third scenario. Students are given seeds and are offered other materials they may need, such as soil or other media, such as sand and clay, pots, water, and asked to design and write a hypothesis about those seeds. Then the children are asked to write an experiment using proper controls that will test that hypothesis and write and present their conclusions in the concept invention phase. What is the difference between these three types of learning cycles? One obvious difference is the amount of guidance or control needed by the teacher. Another is the extent of divergent thinking allowed by the students. All three are viable learning cycles and represent good teaching. However, the format you use depends on your goals and on the capabilities of the learners to carry out investigations on their own. These three learning cycle types were described by Lawson in 1997. The first is called a descriptive learning cycle because students are given the question for research or hypothesis by the teacher. They then follow a set of procedures and make observations and collect data based on prescribed procedures. Many learning cycles take this format if the content is more descriptive in nature and or if the learners are very young or new to this inquiry process. The second type of learning cycle, where the teacher poses the question but students write a hypothesis and design the experiment themselves, even if it's together as a class, is called empirical inductive or abductive, according to Lawson. This format allows for the children to have more ownership over the experiments used and the learning. They design the investigation and learn what it means to control variables, make observations, and collect and report findings. This format helps students learn the scientific processes and would be useful for students who have some experience with science investigations and are practicing their skills. The third allows for the highest level of independent thinking in scientific processes, and that is when students write their own questions and their own hypotheses to test and design the experiment to test the hypothesis themselves. This format lends itself to being the closest of the three to true science. This is the type of learning cycle we would want our students to be able to do after having experience with the previous two types. By now it should be clear that the learning cycle is not a teaching method. It is a philosophy of teaching and learning that is much deeper and more extensive than a simple method. All other methods, in the traditional sense, may be embedded within the 3 or 5-phase learning cycle in the appropriate phases and can be effective if appropriately used. Although the lecture is not as effective as many other instructional techniques, it may be used in the application phase of the learning cycle to expand upon the concept, or it may be used to give instructions. In using lecture, however, you should follow this format to make your lecture as effective as possible. There's 3 parts to a lecture. The first is tell them what you're going to tell them. Since I'm modeling this, I'm now going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. In this segment, I'll be demonstrating effective and less effective ways to use various techniques as embedded within the inquiry-based structure of the learning cycle. An important part of the lecture is the second phase of a lecture, and that is to tell them. That part will be my actual demonstrations. The third thing you do in a lecture is tell them what you just told them. Let me finish the modeling by bringing it all together with a unifying principle or idea. Telling students what you are going to tell them is sometimes called an advance organizer because it helps students see the big picture and fit what they are about to be told in an overall context. This advance organizer can serve as what Ausubel called an anchor for new learning. Keep in mind that this advance organizer can be an activity or a lecture mixed with active participation or a demonstration. In using lecture for K-8 children in particular, it is important to place it after students have had concrete experiences with what you are lecturing about, not before. In the tell them portion of the lecture, use props, that is, use models, pictures, short demonstrations, interject with analogies that students can relate to. Also, in the tell them portion of a lecture, involve the students. Involve them in the question-answer, stories that include them, using them as assistants to write ideas on the board, solve the problems, to role play, or any other creative ideas that you can think of that will involve the students. Remember, you're trying to give them information you, the teacher, has already assimilated and accommodated, but the children have not. And assimilating and accommodating information presented in an abstract lecture is difficult, even for formal reasoners. Therefore, we need to minimize its use. But when we do use lecture, we have to integrate it with techniques that will make the learning as concrete as possible. In the tell them portion, be sure there are one or just a few main points you are focusing on. My former professor called them golden nuggets. Don't give too many golden nuggets at one time. In the tell them what you told them portion of a lecture, summarize what you just said in its main points. Be sure the golden nuggets are clarified here. Also, continue to engage the students. Instead of telling them directly, for example, ask the students to tell you what the main points of the lecture were. And here's another way. Ask the students to write one question that they think could be a test or quiz question based on what they heard. Select children to come to the board or overhead to write their question. Then use some or all of these questions plus some of your own on the actual test or quiz.